Hey, welcome back to our channel, Ancient to Modern, where we tackle some of the issues that are faced today, not only in the larger world, but specifically within Christianity. One of the ancient subjects that still comes up today is how did we get here, and is there any real proof of God? We're in the middle of a new wave of atheism that is challenging a lot of our foundational presuppositions, and one of these is, does God really exist? There is the feeling still that remains in the world today, especially in the church world, that the Genesis account describes the creation of the earth in 7 24-hour periods. And so one of the objections that we hear today is, how can you really seriously believe that when there's all this other evidence that the earth is millions of years old and didn't happen in 7 24-hour periods? Therefore, some people have completely abandoned Christianity. Well, let me tackle that a little bit. First of all, part of that is based on what I think is a misunderstanding of what Scripture is. The Genesis account, right off the beginning, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and you see a creative process. There's a couple things I think we all notice just reading the story. Let me just describe a few. First, when Scripture says, in the beginning and on the first day, God said, let there be light, that does not necessarily mean a 24-hour period. The Hebrew word there is yom, and yom can mean any designated time period. It doesn't necessarily mean 24-hour day, nor does it most of the time mean a 24-hour day. So when we read that word, I don't think that's really what is happening in Genesis chapter 1. The second thing is that I think we misunderstand exactly what's going on. Scripture does not tell us how, in a scientific way, the earth was created. It really seeks to tell us who we are and why we're here, not a scientific breakdown. So, for instance, if you read through the story, there's a couple things that emerge. First of all, you have, in many ways, this is a theological document. So you have the God of Israel, the one true God. It says he created day and he created night. He created the sun and he created the moon, and he hung them in their places. Now, look at the nations around Israel. Egypt worshipped the god Ra. The Egyptian god was a sun god. A lot of the nations around Israel worshipped a moon-based god. Babylonians were one, the Hittites were another. There were a lot of ancient worlds that quickly identified the similarities between the lunar cycle and a woman's cycle, both about the same time frame. And so very quickly these moon-based, these lunar gods became quickly associated with fertility, which led to a whole lot of other issues. But just stay underneath the surface with me. If Egypt, the big powerful country, worships the sun, and if Babylon and the Hittites and other people worship the moon, and Israel comes along and in their document says, wait a minute, God created the sun and the moon, that's not a scientific statement. That's a theological statement. Egypt was big and huge and powerful. Later on, Babylon was the same. Israel was always tiny and always small and always struggling to find its identity. And here in their document is saying, we might be small, but our God is more powerful than your God. Our God hung the sun in the sky. Our God put the moon there. That is a theological dig at the enemies. Don't feel so confident. You're big now, but in the end, what you worship is part of the created order, and our God put it there. So, Bible's not a scientific document. It's very much a theological one. But it also doesn't really stop there. A lot of time, we forget that these nations were just as clever. These ancient writers were just as smart as we are. We say a lot of things. Boy, there's going to be a day when I get revenge on you. Hey, there's going to be a day when I'm not small anymore and I'm going to grow up. We have all these examples in our literature of someone referring to this coming day when everything will be different. Well, when we use that word, we don't necessarily mean a 24-hour period. Just there'll be a point in time when things are different. So when the Bible uses the word day, it also can mean the same thing. Not a 24-hour period, just, hey, a specific period of time. And so when we have on the third day, the fourth day, very much poetic license is being used by the authors. I think it's important to say one other thing. Just from a strictly, scientific approach to Genesis chapter 1, it's not until the fourth day that we even have the existence of a day in the creation account. It's the fourth day where the sun and the moon are created. We don't have a 24-hour cycle. We don't have the sun and the moon like we understand it now. It's not till the fourth day there is a 24-hour period. So it'd be kind of anachronistic to say that on day 1 and day 2 and day 3 that there is a 24-hour period. One other thing. If you look toward day 6, God put plants and vegetation on the ground, and if you read a straight account of this creation account, these plants grew furiously to their huge mature height. They seeded, they dropped their fruit, they dropped their acorns, they dropped whatever seeds that they needed to reproduce. All in the first day, this furious spurt of growth. Then on hour 25, it all stopped and became the normal rate of growth. I don't think that that's at all what that story meant. It's just talking about God is purposeful. God created a world with boundaries. God created a world of order. I think we all are kind of faced with a conundrum, and that is, if there's just some random explosion billions and billions of years ago and all this mathematical order emerged from it, boy, that just wouldn't even seem possible. How do we get order? How do we get mathematical precision? How do we get predictable orbits? We have scientists now that they'll shoot a rocket off into space to go to Jupiter or go to Saturn. And when they do that, they're not pointing that rocket, they're not pointing that satellite toward the planet. They're pointing it toward to where that planet will be 2 years from now or 3 years from now, because it can be predicted. We know what it's going to do. Such order in this world. It has to come from a rational, creative, loving, beautiful mind. This is kind of important to me. A couple times in my life, I've met people who used to be people of faith. And the reason why they're not now is because their church, their religious leader, gave them a simple challenge. And that challenge was this: you could either believe God or you could believe evolution. And they forced them into that, either one of those camps. There's a young man, I teach at a university. There was a man in my class about 1.5 years ago. He sat on the front row. He's a very good student. I think he's used to sitting there, but he was a little disinterested in my class. He was there because he had to be there. It was one of those gen ed requirements. And about halfway through the class, I was in a conversation about a New Testament topic, and I said something, and I can't remember what I said, but it caused him to stay after class. And he came up to me and he goes, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." And he said, "What do you think about Genesis?" I said, "I don't understand what you mean." He said, "Do you believe that the earth was created in 6 24-hour days?" And I said, "Of course not. I'm willing to let science tell us how the earth came about, and I'm also willing to let Scripture tell us why it came about and how we are to relate to the Creator. No, I believe it's theological. I believe it's poetic license and poetic forms to describe this very important event, but it wasn't ever to tell us scientifically how it got there. It was simply there to tell us who we are and who God is. I believe that the earth is as old as whatever science says it is now, And however old that is now, I believe God is at the heart of not only the original creation, but whatever processes are going on in our earth right now. Anyway, he perked up. He began to pay attention in class, and he began to tell me his story a couple times more, staying late. And finally, at the end of class, he thanked me, and we talked a little bit more, and I told him, go pursue your degree, and the church has a place for you. Well, he wrote me a letter about a year later. This young man was in grad school. It turns out his undergrad degree was in geology, and from a young boy, he liked to study rocks, and especially the rocks with all the fossils in them. And got to high school, he had that interest and began to talk about fossils, and someone from church heard, and the pastor sat him down and told him that he had to make a choice between evolution and God. Young man listened to his pastor and abandoned God for at least a couple years. Well, when he wrote me that letter, he said, listen, I want you to know something. I want you to know that I'm in grad school for geology, and I want you to know that I'm teaching Sunday school class to teenagers, because I don't think that there's any conflict between trying to find out the scientific processes for how we got here and worship or belief in a God that stands behind or above all such processes. You can believe in God and you can believe in evolution. There is no dichotomy. There's no tension there at all. And so if you're one of those who stand and this is an issue for you, doesn't need to be. Scripture is not a science textbook. It's a theology book that tells us about God and who we are in relation to Him. And our scientists tell us how we got here. So I can go and I can go up to some places in the Great Lakes and see where the glaciers have moved. It doesn't challenge me one little bit. I can go to a museum that talks about dinosaurs being millions of years old. Doesn't challenge my faith one little bit at all. Because my God is bigger than any scientific process or scientific textbook. Anyway, as we go forward, I want you guys to ask any question. It can be related to our study of the New Testament going through, or anything related to theology. I wrote a book called I Object, answering 12 common objections to Christianity. We have a chapter on evolution. You can find it on Amazon. Feel free to look it up. So hey, thanks for joining us this week. If you like us, please leave a comment down below, leave us a like, or subscribe to the channel. It's very important that we hear from you, and I'll see you next week.